Okay, guys, so starting to take a look at the Articles of Confederation. This was the first plan for government for the colonies that were now transitioning to become states. So the Constitution will be something that comes later, which is our form of government now, but this was our first plan. And so we're going to look at how this plan came to be and some of its strengths, but more importantly, its weaknesses and why we ended up having to go to the Constitutional Convention. So America's experience with English rule is really going to influence their creation of the Articles of Confederation. They are leery of a person having absolute power or control. They fear a strong central government, and they're also concerned about the power of taxing and regulation of trade. Also, the mindset of the colonists is going to be different. The war brought them together. Each individual kind of saw themselves as, a citizen of Virginia or a citizen of Maryland or the Carolinas or Massachusetts or wherever of the 13 colonies. But the fact that they had a common goal of seeking independence, that helped the colonies unite. But now that the war is over, we are going to start to see the colonists divert back to their view of seeing now their state, okay, not their colony, but their state, as their primary decision maker, and not giving much concern to the national government. So the Articles of Confederation were quickly adopted shortly after the American Revolution, and that may be some reason why there are going to be some major weaknesses within the government. They didn't give themselves time to settle down and really think about the form of government that they wanted to create. The type of government that the Articles of Confederation set up was a republic. So a republic is a government in which citizens rule through their elected representatives. So even though the Declaration declared that all men were created equal and that they have their rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, majority of the citizens now living in the United States feared a direct democracy. They didn't like that the masses could have major power in their hands to decide how the country was going to be governed and the direction it was going to take. So they opted for a more secure sense of a republic. So they would be ruled by representatives. Okay? Now the representatives are going to struggle with, do they represent their state or do they represent the people? We also are going to have a federal system in which the national government shares its powers with the state government. So there will be in some situations where the states have primary power over the national government, but also on the reverse, that the national government will have primary power over the states. It's striking that balance that is going to be difficult with this young government. So ultimately, when the government is made, because they fear the absolute power that King George III had, or even Parliament had over the colonies, they make a rather weak national government. They also decide to give each state one vote, because instead of allowing representation to be based on a state's population, they feel that the representatives are representing their state at the national level, not necessarily representing the people at a national level. So if it's representing each state, then that would mean each state gets one vote. But ultimately, this is going to become a concern because the 23,000 people that live in Georgia is far different from the 200 or more thousand that live in Massachusetts. So they've got to be able to find a way to strike a balance. So under the Articles of Confederation, these are a list of the types of things the federal government was responsible for. These are the powers that the federal government had. One, they could declare war, which makes sense. If the country is going to declare war against another country, they have to do so on a united front. Virginia can't go and declare war on France and expect the remaining colonies to come in to practice and help. Which also means if they can declare war, then they can make peace and sign treaties, okay, as a nation. The federal government can also borrow money on behalf of the United States, okay, not individual. The federal government could also establish a postal system, okay, so line of communication, which is going to be the great glory for the Articles of Confederation and the federal government at this time. And the federal government could also deal with Native Americans. So instead of leaving it up to state legislatures to deal with local natives, they felt it was better for the federal government to be the ones to negotiate with the natives because they may see the native tribes as a foreign entity. Okay? And if they had to declare war on those native tribes, of course, that is a power of the federal government, not individual states. But that pretty much sums up all the power and abilities of the federal government under the Articles of Confederation, because it's very limited, because again, they don't trust a strong central government. So next is a list of things that the federal government could not do, okay, and where the problems are going to start to arise. The first is enforcing the laws. Now, under the Constitution, the executive branch will be the one to enforce the laws. Well, there is no executive branch. We have nobody, single individual or small group of individuals who are going to have that power, okay? Because again, they fear someone having absolute power like King George III. Another concern is the fact that there's nobody to interpret the laws through the national court. So the legislative branch, the representatives of the Articles of Confederation, they can pass laws, but there's nobody there to enforce them with the executive, but there's also no judicial to say, wait a minute, those laws aren't just, or those laws infringe upon the individual rights of the citizens of the United States. So a lack of executive branch, a lack of a judicial branch really does give a lot of power to the legislative branch, more so than maybe they had well intended to give. Other things that the federal government could not do was tax its citizens. Now, this is probably not a surprising limitation on the federal government, because the colonists, now the citizens of the United States, are still very leery of the amount of taxes that the British had imposed on them, and that was one of the leading causes for the war. But the fact that the federal government can't levy taxes, it also means that they can't regulate trade, foreign trade or domestic trade, which means the federal government is at the mercy of the individual states to provide money for them to be able to function as a national government. So taxes are going to be seen as a necessary evil. The federal government also cannot draft an army. So it's kind of interesting. They can declare war, but they can't draft an army. They're going to be relying on the states to provide militia if they were to ever declare a war. The federal government could also not establish a national currency, okay, probably going along with the ties of their ability not to be able to tax or to regulate trade. So each state is going to have its own form of currency. And a lot of this was because of the issue that the United States was in debt, but there are also many individuals, in individual states that were in debt to Great Britain. And there were some people who wanted to print paper money, to have more paper money to be able to pay off those debts. Unfortunately, though, when you print more money, it doesn't just make money out of thin air. It loses the value of the money that already exists. So some people would not get the same value, okay, of the paper money. So there is a lot of back and forth about whether or not to print more money or if they should use actual gold and silver. And so this creates a problem for the federal government. Also, any law that is passed, if they want to amend it or change it, it has to have a unanimous vote. Okay, so nothing can be changed without a unanimous vote from all 13 states. So if one state has a problem with making the change, then it will not happen. Okay, which again gives a lot of power to some of those individual states. Now, not everything was bad for the Articles of Confederation. They did have some strengths. One of those was the Land Ordinance Act of 1785. So as we saw at the end of the American Revolution, that the United States gains control of the territory up to the Mississippi River. So there's a lot of land, and a lot of the former colonies wanted to lay claim to that land. So to avoid conflict, the federal government says everyone has to give up their claims to the Western land. And instead, we will set up a system for that land to eventually become new states. So the best way to do this was to sell off those huge chunks of land. So the government kind of found a loophole, says, well, we can't tax to generate a revenue, but we can sell this new land that we've acquired. So they make the plots of land extremely affordable. Okay, and so the land would be surveyed, then divided into 36-mile little townships. And each township would then be divided into 36 sections of about 1 mile or 640 acres. So people could then purchase a section and divide it, amongst, friends, neighbors, or even family. Once these territories started to be surveyed and mapped out, then Congress would appoint a territorial governor. Okay, okay, and judges to the area. And this became known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So when the territory has about 5,000 voting residents, okay, so 5,000 people living in the territory, the settlers then could write a temporary constitution and they could elect their own local government, okay? Over time, as the population continues to grow and it reaches 60,000, either naturally over time or more people moving there, then the settlers could write a state constitution, which could be approved by Congress and they would be granted statehood. So that is how a lot of our Western states are going to be formed. As people start to leave the original 13 states and start moving west, as their populations grow, they'll apply for statehood and then be able to have representation in Congress. So it was an incentive. You know, if you were to purchase one of those townships, you wanted to get as many people to move out there so that you could go through these steps to eventually get statehood. Because once you had statehood, you had representation within Congress and you had a voice. But there were failures that came to light with the Articles of Confederation. The lack of taxes, the lack of common currency, and the lack of regulation of trade really became evident in what will be an incident known as Shays Rebellion. So many of the elite or wealthy liked the idea of higher taxes. The lenders wanted higher taxes, those who lent money, because it meant that they would be guaranteed to be paid back. Unfortunately, though, farmers who typically owed the money for the land or equipment that they owned, this meant that they may not be able to pay it back. And so what we found is a lot of the farmers were deeply in debt. And then the Eastern merchants pushed through a state tax that would hurt the farmers even more. And so a lot of these farmers had been the soldiers in the Continental Army, and their farms had suffered when they were off at war. So they felt really discouraged by this new government that they fought to create because the government wasn't trying to help them keep their farms. So many farmers, particularly in Massachusetts, petitioned for relief to try to have the courts closed so that their cases couldn't be heard and essentially for them to lose their farms and sometimes even be thrown in prison for debt. Daniel Shay, who had been a soldier in the Continental Army, he is going to lead a rebellion. And, you know, it's no surprise. I mean, these farmers were patriots and they had learned through their efforts during the war that if your government doesn't seem to be serving your best interests, then you rebel, you fight back. And that's exactly what Daniel Shays and the other farmers of Massachusetts had done. And so Daniel Shay led an army of about 1,200 farmers to try to force the courts to close. They will encounter the Massachusetts militia. 4 farmers were killed and the rest tried to scatter. Daniel Shays and others were arrested, but then eventually acquitted. Okay, they were not convicted for their crimes. But this put a fear in many citizens throughout the United States. You know, was there a potential for rebellion to spread to other states beyond Massachusetts? And for some of the founding fathers like George Washington, he says, we look like childish, like a childish country, a young country. We fought for our independence, and yet now we can't manage our own country. And so this put a lot of pressure and a call for representatives from all the states to come together to really look at the Articles of Confederation and try to figure out how can we fix the problems with our new government. And ultimately, that is going to turn into the Constitution Convention. They're going to throw out the Articles of Confederation and start writing the Constitution, which will be our form of government today. So ultimately, this is just a comprehensive list of looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Congress couldn't levy or collect taxes, 9 of 13 to pass the law, but having to have 13 of 13 or a unanimous vote to be able to amend it. There's no executive branch to enforce the laws. There's no judicial branch to say that whether or not the laws are just. Congress couldn't regulate trade, whether domestically or internationally. One of the key successes, though, was their system of land, being able to sell off those the new land that they had acquired and setting up a system to create new states as that land became occupied. Also, the Articles of Confederation was the government that ended up signing the Treaty of Paris, ultimately ending the war in 1783.